Hi, I'm Ryan from ratings.com. Today we'll be doing a review of the ASUS TUF Gaming VG27AQL1A. We'll be evaluating it on our standardized test bench to see how it performs and if you should buy it. This monitor is the successor to the very popular TUF Gaming VG27AQ, but with a brighter display, much wider gamut, and slightly higher max refresh rate. The VG27AQL1A features a 170Hz 1440p IPS panel. It also supports Adaptive Sync as well as ELMB Sync, which we'll talk about in the review. The first thing that stands out for the ASUS TUF Gaming VG27AQL1A is the very gamer-oriented aesthetic. It has a lot of sharp angles and glossy accents along the back of the display. The stand supports the monitor well and offers a good range of ergonomic adjustments, including height adjustment and rotation into portrait mode. It does have a pretty wide footprint, but the legs are pretty thin, so they don't take up much space. There's a pretty standard range of inputs with 2 HDMI ports and a DisplayPort. However, the DisplayPort only has a bandwidth of DP 1.2. This means that at max refresh rate, you'll be limited to an 8-bit color depth. If you want to get 10-bit color depth, you'll be limited to 120 Hz. Now, let's take a look at the tests. We'll start with the contrast. A high contrast ratio is important if you use the monitor in the dark for deep dark scenes. Like most IPS displays, the VG27AQL1A has fairly mediocre contrast, so in a dark room, blacks will tend to look more gray, which is not ideal. Local dimming is a feature that controls the brightness of the individual zones of the backlight. This allows for much deeper dark scenes in things like video games, as the area of dark objects can be further darkened. As a result, the overall contrast can be boosted. Although the ASUS TUF Gaming VG27AQL1A has a local dimming feature, it's terrible. It's called dynamic dimming in the menu. You can enable it while in SDR, but in HDR it automatically gets enabled. There are only 4 dimming zones, so the feature does next to nothing in real content. Now, a high peak brightness is important either in a bright room to counteract glare, or if you want brighter highlights and a more impactful image, especially in high dynamic range or HDR games. This monitor gets decently bright. In SDR, it should be bright enough to combat glare in most viewing environments, but if you have any direct sunlight, it could be an issue. In HDR, it gets quite a bit brighter, but is still only okay. It doesn't get bright enough to make highlights really pop in HDR. Also important for a bright room is good reflection handling. The TUF Gaming VG27AQL1A has a hazy screen coating to help diffuse reflections and reduce their intensity. Overall, bright rooms shouldn't be an issue at all. A potential downside of a hazy coating is if it causes small details like text to appear grainy. Text clarity is also impacted by a bunch of factors though, like the subpixel arrangement. Overall, it's decent as you can see in these images. The screen coating doesn't have much of an impact. The top photo is with Windows ClearType, which helps diagonal lines look clearer. Without ClearType, in the bottom image, it's alright but does lack some subpixel detail. Good viewing angles are important to ensure details at the far sides of the screen don't look washed out. Like most IPS displays, the VG27AQL1A has good viewing angles. The horizontal viewing angles are great, but the vertical viewing angles are only okay. This shouldn't be much of an issue though, since at moderate angles, it still looks good. An overall uniform screen brightness and color is important when playing video games, to avoid distracting areas that are overly dark or bright. This does vary between units, but we expect the unit we bought to be about typical. The overall screen has very similar brightness, which is great and shouldn't be an issue. The black uniformity on our unit is bad. There's noticeable IPS glow from both the top corners and clouding throughout. This does change from unit to unit quite a bit, so keep in mind that yours could be better or worse than ours. The local dimming does nothing to help the uniformity, and actually it's significantly worse thanks to the difference between the illuminated zones and the zones that are off. Accuracy in the standard sRGB color space is important as it's the standard for computer use. The color accuracy on this monitor out of the box is bad. White balance is significantly off, and most colors are noticeably inaccurate. The colors are also quite a bit oversaturated. There is a dedicated sRGB mode to clamp the color space, but the accuracy is even worse than the racing mode accuracy, which is disappointing. If you need this monitor for any kind of color critical work, we recommend calibrating it. If you want to take full advantage of this monitor and display vivid colors in things like high dynamic range or HDR games, then the VG27AQL1A is a good choice. It has great coverage of the commonly used DCI-P3 color space, but only okay coverage of the wider Rec 2020 color space. A high refresh rate is important for gaming. It allows the image to be drawn on the screen faster, which makes it more responsive. And if the monitor supports variable refresh rates, then you can get a smooth experience without tearing regardless of the changing frame rate. The TUF boasts a respectable 170Hz frame rate, and both FreeSync and G-Sync support means compatibility with new AMD or NVIDIA graphics cards. However, like most monitors, the G-Sync compatibility feature only works over a DisplayPort connection. When playing video games, a fast response time is important for the clearest image without distracting blur. The TUF Gaming VG27AQL1A has great response times at its max refresh rate. There is some overshoot in our recommended overdrive setting of 60. If that bothers you, you can try setting the overdrive to either 40 or 20, which both have less overshoot but are a bit slower. If the frame rate drops when you're gaming, then luckily the response times is still good. Unfortunately, you'll want to lower the overdrive down to 20 if your game can only run at 60 Hz. The higher settings result in long inverse ghosting trails behind moving objects. If you want a set and forget overdrive setting, you're probably better off sticking to 20. If you really want the clearest image when playing fast-paced games, then black frame insertion or backlight strobing features are useful to reduce the blur caused by the persistence of the image during a full frame. You can enable the backlight strobing on the VG27AQL1A between 120 and 170 Hz. Unlike most monitors, you can also enable VRR at the same time as BFI with ASUS's ELMB Sync feature. Now, a low input lag is really important for a responsive feel when playing video games, and unsurprisingly, this monitor is excellent due to the 170 Hz refresh rate. At both max refresh rate and at 60 Hz, the input lag is extremely low. So, this brings us to the main question. Should you buy this monitor? Well, firstly, it's definitely a good gaming monitor. It has most of the features you would want for gaming, including using BFI and VRR at the same time for extra motion clarity. The response times, although good, are not as good as some alternatives. It also has a wide color gamut, making the colors in HDR games look nice and saturated, although it lacks the brightness and contrast to really make the most of it. Unfortunately for the ASUS TUF Gaming VG27AQL1A, there is a lot of competition in the mid-range 1440p gaming monitor space. The most direct competitor to this one would be the Gigabyte M27Q. It's the same size, with the same resolution and same refresh rate. They have very similar specs overall, but the M27Q gets brighter in SDR, has better response times, and has a wider color gamut. It basically has the TUF beat in every category except ergonomics. The M27Q also tends to be less expensive, and also has a USB-C port and built-in KVM switch if you use the same setup for gaming and office work. The only downside to keep in mind for the M27Q is that it has a BGR subpixel layout, which can cause some minor text clarity issues. If you want to learn more about it, check out our video on the M27Q. If the extra office features aren't important to you, and you're just looking for a pure gaming monitor with similar specs, then check out the Acer Nitro XV272U KV-BMII-PRZX. It has significantly better gaming performance than the TUF, and depending on your local pricing, should be similarly priced to the ASUS.